Good afternoon, everyone. I am Mahzarin, and I'm joined with Sheherazad to host the Zoroastrianism 101 panel.
Thanks, Mahzarin. I'm Sheherazad. And Merzi's already introduced what this panel is going to be. So Dasturji has covered quite a lot of interesting stuff in his earlier talk. So we've got some pre-planned questions, which is going to be followed by questions that you all from the audience can ask by simply scanning a QR code that's going to be up on the screen shortly. So feel free to do that. And let's get started with the questions. Okay. So Dasturji, I'd like to shoot this question at you. What was the role of priests historically, and has this changed into the modern world?
The first and basic rule of the priest was to spread the religion across the 7 regions of the world. Now, after we came to India, it has been marginalized to prayers and rituals only. But the basic rule and the principle of the Moabed was to spread the religion, to encourage the people to follow the good faith, to tell them to come to the good path and show them the path of Humata, Hukta and Varashta. Slowly after coming to India, that has all changed.
Yuhan, would you like to shed some light on that?
Yes, so I can also add that in the pre-modern world, Zoroastrian priests had a much bigger role than we see now. They were also government administrators, they did excise duties, they were involved in taxation, they were involved in law. So the priesthood had a much, much broader remit than we see today.
Thank you so much. Our next question is, when did Zoroastrians start using the Sadra and Kasti, and how has its practice evolved over time?
So, yeah, it's a very interesting question and a little bit of a challenging one. We can see very clearly that we have an Avestan word for the Kasti, Iviyangana, and it's very old. So that thing is not in any great debate. The evidence for the Sadra shows up later, but that doesn't mean that it wasn't old. And I think this is one thing that's very important to understand, that in the historical record, we don't always have every stage of Zoroastrianism well documented. So when you ask me a question, if the evidence is there, I can tell you we see it in this moment, but there may be indirect evidence that suggests it's earlier or potentially that it has been changed later. So these are always some of the things. But we have a wonderful Pahlavi text which is available in translation, the Chimi Kustik, the meaning of the Kasti, as we say in the Parsi pronunciation. And that is a phenomenal text. There's so much interesting material connected with the symbolism of what it stands for, not just how to use it or why, but precisely what does it mean in a more deeply philosophical and spiritual sense. Dasturji, would you like to?
It was said and being related to us that the practice of wearing the Sadra and Kasti, or the practice to wear the Kusti at least started during the Jamshid's time, in the reign of the Peshtadian dynasty. But how and where they were wearing it, because Ivangan also represents the leaves of the palm trees, which were originally twigged and kept on the armpits. So we don't have the proper record of the history. So when we started wearing the Sudra and Kusti.
If I could add one thing to this. In the British Museum, we have the gold Oxus treasures from Central Asia. And there we have what looks like one of the earliest figural representations of a Zoroastrian priest. And there you can see that it is something that looks very much like what we would call a Kusti. And that's maybe 6th, 5th century BC. So we know it's very, very old.
Thank you so much. Sheherazad?
Difficult to choose.
There's a lot of questions coming in.
Go slow, guys.
Yeah.
Okay. Some people are providing answers as well. Stop doing that. Okay. Okay. Do we want to start with the contentious stuff right now, or should we still go easy?
Go contentious.
Let's do it. Why am I considered dirty if I'm on my period?
So I'll take this one. So I can explain to you what the texts say. I'm not going to explain to you what the moral value of that is for you, okay? So one thing that needs to be understood about Zoroastrian purity laws in their broad sense, which is that any bodily excreta, that is anything that comes out of your body, right? So bathroom activities, when you drink too much, when you sweat, your tears, hair, fingernails, all of these things were understood by the ancient Zoroastrians as basically, once they leave your body, they're considered dead matter. That is, and so essentially considered impure. So the short answer to this question is that menstrual blood, but blood of any kind, once it's sort of extracted from the body, was understood in a broader context of Zoroastrian purity law. So if a priest were to cut themselves shaving, for example, and they were bleeding, they would not be allowed, for example, they ideally should not be performing any rituals. Now, that obviously is something that we may look at very differently today. You may not see, a tear as being something that is impure, but that is how it was understood in the past, and that is what shapes the entire more complex ritual system that has made up the Zoroastrian texts from a very early period to what we see today. That is at least the sort of historical, philological, textual understanding. Now, one's lived reality, how you feel about that, that's a different question altogether. So I could just speak for this aspect of it.
Even, I would like to just add over there that even the Morbids in the past, if they were going undergo any operations or that physically his part were extracted from the body, even he was told to leave the priesthood. So it is not only for the woman's side, it was also for the priest also, that we have to be very particular about our own dietary things and everything. So this was always remember that our religion is quite old. It's almost 3,500 years old. What circumstances were that time and what prevailed that time, we were just taking down up till now. Times have changed.
And if I can add something to this, 2 years ago I wrote an article on Islamic polemics against Zoroastrian notions of menstrual purity. That is, Muslim critiques in the early Islamic period about the very fact that Zoroastrians have all these practices. And then you see something very interesting, because you realize that many of these bodily practices, how people live, how they choose to inhabit the world, really help define their identity markers. That is, what separates you from the other guy or the other lady is precisely that you follow these things. So I think it's worth keeping in mind that whether one likes it or not, whether one views it as being a positive or not, these are some of the historically defining characteristics of how other people viewed us as well.
Just to lighten it up, someone asked why was Zariab not on the prayers yesterday? Could be he was cut.
Our next question is, what is the importance of praying in a fire temple instead of at home?
I don't think there is anything wrong in praying at home and in praying in the fire temple. But only thing that you are praying in the fire temple, you are charging your batteries, you are in front of a fire. And we have always practiced and revered fire as the son of Ahura Mazda. Remember one thing, we have only one God and we worship Ahura Mazda. Zarathustra is a prophet. Fire, water, sun, moon, all the natural creations we revere. And while praying the Avanyash, we should face the water. While praying Mahabhaktanyash, we should face the moon. While praying Khurshed and Mernyas, we face the sun. So all these are different things which we tend to attune ourselves, and it is through these things which we are trying to attune to Ahura Mazda.
If I could add to that, I think it's worth keeping in mind that, if you take 1500 BC as a start date for Zoroastrianism, we don't see the archaeological evidence for major fire temple structures until much, much later in the game. So in the Sasanian period, say 224 to 651, is when you see the first major giant fire temple complexes being built. And so the Adur Gushnasp fire out near, what is in Iranian Azerbaijan today, was attacked and destroyed by Heraclius, the Roman emperor, in in sort of revenge for when the Sasanians attacked and destroyed Jerusalem and took the true cross back into the Sasanian context. So it's worth saying that when we talk about major fire temples, like the ones we have in India today, that particular aspect of our religiosity is probably sort of shows up halfway through the history of Zoroastrianism. In the very beginning, surely there weren't these major structures and everything was done, in a sense, outdoors or in people's houses. So the domestic fire would have been always historically old. But the consecrated ones are, in a sense, much newer in the broad history of Zoroastrianism.
I would just like to add that when you oneself can feel that when you are in a fire temple or when you are in that area of worship, wherever it is, it may be a darbe mein, it will be a prayer hall, the energy, that thoughts, that surrounding things are so positive that you yourself feel charged. So once you are in front of something and you are attuning yourself to Aura Mazda, you are getting almost charged in your life.
I'd like to jump in and take the opportunity to plant a seed into your head with a simple analogy. Would you rather work out at home or in the gym? Next question related to numerology. What is the significance of the number 7 that we keep seeing in Zoroastrianism? You talk about Amesha Spentas, the Haftashin, the story of creation. Yuhan, you want to touch upon that?
Yeah, I'll take this one. So I've actually published on numerology, so this is one thing I can say. So Zoroastrianism has numerology built into it in a very, very early period. It's already in Avestan. And so, for example, when they talk about the Yatha Vario prayer, it's 21 words of 7 words per line. So 3 by 7 gives you 21. And from an early period, they understood the 3 as being good thoughts, words, good deeds, and the 7 as representing the Amesha Spentas, and the 21 represents what eventually came to be understood as encoding the 21 nusks, or these larger books of the Grand Avesta, of which today we only have basically one complete sort of text, the Videvdat. All the others are texts that we have written in the old sources, but we either have nothing of them or we have a little bit, like a few paragraphs here and there that have survived in other texts. So numerology is something that goes back a very, very long way and helps define and encode why these things have meaning. That is, the numbers themselves represent structures, and the structures connect to other structures, so that Zoroastrianism operated with what I call correlative thought. That is the idea that all the things that you do in your religiosity are, in a sense, all connected to each other. It's not that something is separate from something else. And that's why learning about Zoroastrianism in a cohesive way allows you to sort of maximize its, let's say, spiritual or even intellectual potential.
Thank you so much. We have another question. Why did it take until the Sasanian times for the Avesta to be canonized from an oral tradition? Was the oral tradition not enough?
Okay, so yeah, I have a book that should be appearing very, very soon, and I deal with this problem because you have this amazing thing, right? That from the linguistic evidence, we can see that Zoroastrianism, the text, the earliest material, the Gathas, the Yatha, they probably go back to around 1500 BC. But we don't actually have the Avestan script produced until the Sasanian period. So what happened in the meanwhile? And I think it's really important to realize that when in the modern world, we sometimes see orality as being a sort of a second order thing, something that is sort of a proto version of writing and literacy. But what orality lets you do is it allows the priest to decide who they will teach. And in that sense, it's a control system. It's a system that lets you maintain authority because the priest decides who they teach and they decide who they teach, and it goes through the generations. Now, the writing aspect probably developed in the Sasanian period precisely because you have this massive multicultural empire, and now the Christians, the Manichaeans, the Jews are all producing writing, and they're saying, look, we have a book, we have something that has that gives it its own unique power in the world, social power. And so at that point, it seems to us, the scholars, that the Zoroastrians felt that they had to, in a sense, compete, because you have this sort of broader economy, and you have, at that time in the Sasanian period, lots of people converting to Christianity and such, even prior to the arrival of Islam. So this was, in a sense, part of the competitive political economy of religion. And that's when they start talking about the Avesta as a concept. And they always talk about the Avesta and the Zand, that is, the old Avestan scriptures put down into writing, and the Zand, meaning the Pahlavi translations of that. And we even see from the priesthood that some priests were experts in Avestan, but did not know the Zand. And some knew the Zand, but did not perform the Avestan. So you had scholastic priests and you had ritual priests. And this structure had so much diversity in it, it really got reduced in the, let's say, the post-Sasanian period, where essentially they were being squeezed, where, all of a sudden you don't have enough clientele to be so subspecialized and you have to start doing everything. Much like how we all feel as scholars of Zoroastrianism, where we're teaching huge periods of history, where our counterparts in Christianity or Hinduism or Islam, something can, work on a small period. I met a Swiss historian who told me that she worked from 1450 to 1500. And she said, how long do you work? And I said, about 2,500 years. And she looked at me like I was a crazy person. So,
It was during the Sasanian times and periods that Dastoor Adarbat Marespan conceived and brought all the prayers together. And it was his last this thing, that our Khorde Avesta, which we recite today, the Patet Pashimani, where we speak, and where it's written by Charles Zartoshtrin Adarbat Marespan. So it was during the time of this Sasanian Empire, by this high priest, Dastoor Adarbat Marespan, that our texts were all conceptualized and written.
And if I could add, the way that he proved that he was spiritually superior is the texts tell us that he performed this ordeal of pouring molten brass on his chest and survived. And that was a proof that he was the right man for the job. So, if you think about the requirements to get a job today, they're much, much easier.
That's how he got his name, Adarbad. The next question is, who is considered to be a Zoroastrian? Because I'm confused with the inscriptions of Cyrus, where there is no mention of Zarathustra and more of the Babylonian god Marduk.
No, you can see on the inscription of Cyrus that he has written that it's Arya Putra. And I always believed in Parsa and a Parsa Chitra. He has always said that he was a Parsi and a Zartushan follower of Aura Mazda. You can see that on his inscription on the cuneic form when you go to Iran. I think it's at Shiraz or somewhere. Kerman. That's Darius, but it came from Darius and Cyrus, both of them.
Yuhan, bring in Marduk.
Yeah, so, Marduk, yes. So,
Marduk, yeah.
Bel Marduk was sort of the apex deity of the Babylonians. And when Cyrus conquers the Babylonians, he creates this cylinder where he basically says, the Babylonian ruler who ruled before me was corrupt. And I am the correct person, the right person chosen to take over Babylon. And I should say that I completely disagree with many people and many of my colleagues about this. I don't see the Cyrus cylinder as being a declaration of human rights at all. And most of us who work on the ancient Near East see it as just a typical example of Near Eastern propaganda. You come in, you conquer an area, and you say the people who ruled before, they became corrupt, and we have been chosen to replace them. So for me, I'm much more cynical about this. I see this document as representing something very, very different. But having said that, what he does do is that he does liberate certain minority communities and allow them to return to their homeland. So for example, he does this famously with the Jews, and therefore he, in 2nd Isaiah, he is called the Anointed One and seen as being their great savior. Now I just should add again, deporting people and relocating people in the ancient world was extremely common. So Darius found Libyans that he was unhappy with, and he relocated them to Bactria. Bactria is modern-day Afghanistan. So this is just part of a much broader imperial projects of how they manage these things. So from my perspective, I don't see this as human rights at all. I think it's a purely modern fantasy.
No, I mean, the question wasn't more so about human rights, so to say. It was about Cyrus being a Zoroastrian himself.
There's no evidence of any kind of Cyrus making any such claims about his Persian or, let's say, Elamite, whatever he was exactly, his claims of religiosity. That he just doesn't say it. That's not to say that he didn't have religious views or he didn't have a certain, there's no evidence for it. All the evidence that we see for Zoroastrianism and Zarathustra does not show up in any of the inscriptions. Never in the Old Persian inscriptions, never in the Sasanian inscriptions. Obviously it's there, but not talked about. But for an imperial religious project as we see it, all that's said about Ahura Mazda consistently and all over the place, all of that is done by Darius. Darius does it, and then Xerxes, his son, follows. Cambyses, who ruled before him, doesn't produce anything that... But again, these are accidents of history. We don't know precisely what it is. It does look like the way Darius produces it and how much he upsells Ahura Mazda is that he's making a new claim relative to what had come before. So it looks very much like they probably went and conquered new areas and didn't impose their own religious system. They just claimed to be the new heirs of the territory. But Darius does that as well, but he also says, Vashna Ahura Mazdaha. He says, by the greatness of Ahura Mazda, I did X, I did Y.
Thank you so much. We have a lot of questions and a lot of comments as well, including someone trying to find a spouse for their friend in the questions. There's a very interesting question. As there is no written rule book as such, how can Zoroastrians today, living in secular societies, ensure that their actions and lifestyles are in accordance with the religion? The question just turned. Oh. Is it enough to solely follow good thoughts, good words, and good deeds?
We are taught the basic, this thing is to be a good human being, whether you live in any society, whether you practice it anywhere. The first and foremost thing in any community, any religion, is to behave like a good human being. So whether you are there in which society, secular society, I think we in India live in the most secular society, still as one of them said, 1.4 billion. Yeah, in 1.4 billion with Zarathustra, just in hardly lakhs of numbers came out. Why? Because our morals, our thoughts, our teachings were so rooted that we came out. And today also in the world, you can see that people like who are sitting in this audience, like who spoke, Sir Ron Khalifa and all, have come out in this society also as the champions. So imagine, we are just 100,000 in numbers, and we are still the champions. And it is for you all to carry on this tradition, and you all to preserve it, and you want to pass it on, this legacy, to others.
So if I can add something from the pre-modern context, this is actually not a new question. In fact, in every period that we have good material, we can see that Zoroastrians grappled with this question. Everyone knows good thoughts, words, and deeds are old. I mean, they're in the Gathas. It's as old as it gets. But what does that actually mean? What is good? How do you determine that? And that's what the Zoroastrian material, in a sense, tries to answer. It tries to define how to manage this dualistic universe you live in, where you're not always sure what is good. Sometimes it's very clear-cut, but sometimes it's not. And in the text it says that what makes evil powerful is that evil mimics being good. So, it's like that famous sort of anecdote when you come to a fork in the road and there are two people there and you ask them which is the right path and they both tell you two different things. The system of Zoroastrianism is designed to help you work out how to answer that question. And what the texts tell us, because they were produced by priests, is that you should ask your priests. That the priests explain to you intellectually how the full system would have operated in that particular moment. Now, obviously, in secular society, in modern days, that sometimes works up to a limited point, it doesn't. So part of what I think the real challenge of living as a Zoroastrian today, anywhere, is to really ask yourself, even if you think it's good, how do you work that out? And I think that's the great epistemological challenge of Zoroastrianism, not just a moral challenge. It's figuring out how to tell good from bad, how to determine what is the right thing. And that's a complex question. And they always struggled with this. We see this in the material. Because you even have different priests. in the Sasanian period, for example, giving different opinions on the same issue. So they had to grapple with the fact that, one Vada Dasturji tells them X and the other one is telling them Y. And they still had to work that out.
Let's connect this to the final question, which is, what message do you have for the next generation to carry forward our traditions and religion?
What we have got from our forefathers, we would like to carry it on and pass to our children. Not only good thoughts, words, and deeds, but Asha, the truth, the philanthropy, which our community is very famous for, the charity, to help the poor, the most important thing in Yathavarya prayers where we say that one who helps the needy and the poor is the closest to Aura Mazda, is closest to D. This all values, this all ethics, this all morals has to be transformed and told to your children and passed it on for the future generation. That will keep us together. All these little things, instead of exploring more and more and going on in the modern world, I don't say don't do it, but this little thing will help our community to stay together and prosper in future also.
So I cannot disagree with any of this at all. And I think that's very, very, very good advice. I would add this bit. I was, so just a little background about myself. I was born in Bombay. I lived in India till I was 12. Then we moved to Massachusetts in the US. I've worked in the US, Canada. Now I live here. I work here at Oxford. And one of the things that I realized when I was a young kid growing up in diaspora is how little I actually knew about the history that I hadn't heard from my grandparents or my parents and such. And I would say that one of the greatest privilege that I got from going into this discipline for myself was just that the more I learned and the more I read, the richer I felt about my own lived experience. They pay me to do what I would pay them to do. And so one thing I would say to you is that just read. Get your hands on everything you can and read and learn about your history, your culture. You don't have to like it, you don't have to agree with it, but the more you explore and the more you learn, the more enriched you will feel as a person. And you're all relatively young. But I've never met any Zoroastrian who didn't eventually have children and then suddenly feel this insane sense of anxiety that they didn't know as much as they would like to teach their kids, especially if you live outside of the Indian context where you may not have a lot of family around or a lot of infrastructure or communal support. So I would just say that one of the easiest ways to do this is just read.
I think I'm going to take an opportunity here to acknowledge the organizers for the theme of this Congress being reigniting connections. As being part of the younger generation, we often feel that, there's our community is constantly divided on a lot of issues. There were challenges before. There are challenges now. The internet amplifies it. Look for the commonalities and celebrate them.
That concludes the Q&A session. Thank you so much, Professor Vevaina, and thank you so much, Vada Dasturji. And thank you, Sheherazad. You're a lovely co-moderator.
Thank you, Mahzarin.